Now, later this year, as you all well know, Australia will host a referendum on a very crucial constitutional issue, changing the constitution to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' views are better represented in Parliament. And Jacinta Price, she is, of course, a country Liberal Party senator from the Northern Territory, and she's a past Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs. Of course, Jacinta worked here at CIS from early 2018 until last year when she was elected to Parliament. And she's the author of a CIS paper in 2021 called Worlds Apart, Remote Indigenous Disadvantage in the Context of a Wider Australia. Please welcome Jacinta.
Very much, Tom, and thank you all this evening. It's lovely to be back here at CIS. It feels like it's been long overdue. Well, you know a bit about my background, so I won't go on too much. I will get straight into my argument. In 2006, African-American author and expert in race relations, multiculturalism and affirmative action, Shelby Steele, authored his book, White Guilt: How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promise of a Civil Rights Era. In it, Steele recounted his experience growing up in the civil rights era, his work as a civil rights activist, and what he witnessed in the decades since. He reflected on what he called a moral vacuum, a period where whites had forfeited the moral authority due to their own guilt about American history. In the book he wrote, "Most any time race is given importance, positively or negatively, people are hiding from their true motivations. In the age of racism, whites said blacks were inferior, so as not to see their own desire to exploit them, their true motivation. In the age of white guilt, whites support all manner of silly racial policies without seeing that their true motivation is simply to show themselves innocent of racism. Despite attempts to rewrite it in Australian history, is notably different from that of the United States. And yet we undoubtedly are experiencing a similar period. We're living in a time where some Australians are feeling guilty for events of the past and the impacts that some are still feeling today, and others are more than happy to take advantage of that. No one can deny that Australians have done a lot, spent a lot, and given a lot in the name of correcting those wrongs. But so long as there is something to be gained from victimhood, we will forever have victims. It's my belief that in the name of recognition and an attempt to undo the wrongs of the past, some Australians are attempting to enshrine a dangerous, divisive and costly mistake into the Constitution. For the purposes of our debate tonight, we must acknowledge that the proposed voice body is not simply a means of recognition. It is a Trojan horse and a transfer of power. The voice movement is a dangerous attempt to undermine democracy and the fundamental belief of equality between citizens. What may have started as an act of goodwill, as a simple and modest gesture, has become a legal nightmare that would give a chosen few the ability to bring government to a halt. When Prime Minister Albanese released the wording of his proposed constitutional amendment, legal experts on both sides of the debate came out strongly to condemn, warn against, and celebrate the broad powers of the voice that the voice would have. Greg Craven, a constitutional expert, said that the proposed change was, quote, far worse than I had contemplated, the worst position being. Key architect of the Uluru Statement and one of the members of the working group who came up with the final wording said, Parliament will not be able to shut the voice up, and the Indigenous body will speak to all parts of the government, including the Cabinet, ministers, public servants, as well as statutory officers and agencies from the Reserve Bank to Centrelink. These powers include the ability to challenge in the High Court any decisions made by the executive on which the voice feels it was not properly listened to. The voice is an inherently divisive body, enshrining into the Constitution special powers for one group based solely on racial heritage. Reference to specific race was removed from the Constitution in 1967. And after 55 years of work to close the gap and become one people, this proposed amendment seeks to enshrine it in an exclusive body. It draws a line between Indigenous Australians and everyone else and labels one group as different, as other, as in perpetual need of special help, perpetual victimhood. Despite claims the voice was born out of consensus of Indigenous Australians and the message that we should vote yes because they asked us for it, the reality is that the voice is even dividing Indigenous Australians. As you can see before you, as Warren and I are proof of, not all Indigenous Australians want the voice. It should be perfectly obvious to everyone, not all Indigenous peoples think the same. Throughout the Uluru Statement process, there has been dissent, disagreement between Indigenous leaders and communities. Yet, we're being asked to say yes to a body that they claim would, and we do not even know how yet, represent all of us on issues that apparently impact all of us. If you've seen on TV the problems impacting my hometown right now, you'd know that they are hugely different to those faced by Aboriginal people in Marrickville. In addition to being a costly mistake to many other ways, the voice also represents a significant financial cost. Current funding for Indigenous issues in Australia is estimated to be around $100 million per day, about $4 for every Australian per day, and Australians are being asked to spend a few $100 million or more on a referendum. In that referendum, Australians are being asked to write a blank cheque to the government to set up and fund a whole new body with no detail of how it would work. The Voice to Parliament is not the product of extensive consultation with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. It is a product of conversations with a few and signatures of 250. The Voice to Parliament will undermine the principles of democracy and the equality that underpins them and grants special powers to a few. There's one thing that I do agree with was the need for reform. There is absolutely the need to do what we've never done, which is reform the organisations that have funded the millions of dollars that are responsible for closing the gap. We have never done that. That is where we need to begin. There is absolutely no guarantee that constitutionally enshrining a voice is going to provide the outcomes that we all share, that we all seek for Indigenous Australians. The aim is to close the gap. However, to suggest that we enshrine a voice suggests that we will perpetually have a gap. So it defeats the purpose of what it is we're attempting to accomplish. On one hand, we're told in Shireen's argument that the governments don't listen to those of us who are elected to Parliament, about the circumstances happening in our own hometown. And I would admit, Albanese has utterly ignored the fact that I have called out to him and told him what would happen in my hometown if alcohol restrictions were lifted. So how then can we be sure that leaving the responsibility to the Parliament to create the voice within the Constitution is going to guarantee the outcomes that we're in fact after? When it comes to the Uluru Statement, again, the Aboriginal people that I speak to feel left out completely from those negotiations. They feel disenfranchised by other Aboriginal people in powerful positions. We need to sort out our own issues as Indigenous Australians before we go and constitutionally enshrine a voice that supposedly represents each and every one of us. That is where most of our problems lie. The people that I represent, the grassroots Indigenous Australians who were ignored during those consultations, they do not support the voice going forward because of the fact that it is their firm belief that if their voices were being ignored, then their voices will be ignored by the voice. And that is why I do not support the voice to Parliament. Thank you.
Jacinta, Tony says this proposal is for harmony. It's not divisive. Your response?
While the Prime Minister has, suggested to the Australian people that, it's a modest proposal, it won't lend itself to the possibility of litigation, it won't have the power to have a say over, everything, all decisions through Parliament, but those that are specific to Aboriginal Australians. Well, members of the working group have turned around and said the complete opposite. So it's already demonstrating divisiveness through the Prime Minister telling us one lot of things and then working group members saying other things. The fact that the working group in the end have managed to create something that they've wanted, regardless of the concerns that Mark Dreyfus had, the seeking legal advice on the matter of, including reference to the executive and what that might mean. Despite those concerns, the Prime Minister has folded, and ultimately he does not have control over this process. That to me is a demonstration of divisiveness already, despite the fact that it's claimed that it's about bringing us together. We've had the Human Rights Commissioner recently argue that in fact it doesn't recognise equality in terms of human rights. It is providing the opportunity for an Indigenous voice to have a say in matters regarding any issue really, and any issue that is concerning for Indigenous Australians is concerning for Australians, all Australians. So therefore, the voice will have a say over issues that impact all of Australia, but other Australians don't have the same opportunity at having that say. And as far as I'm concerned, that is divisive. As somebody who has grown up with Warlpiri culture and Warlpiri, if you want to call it governance, I find it deeply concerning, especially as an advocate of domestic and family violence, that in many communities are often run by those who are powerful because their means of attaining power sometimes involve violence, threatening behaviour, and this is something that obviously does vary from community to community, but there are vulnerable, voiceless people in many communities who don't get heard because of the leadership in some of those communities. And it doesn't lend itself to what I believe should be a fair representation for Indigenous Australians. It is much more of the, in traditional terms, the fittest survive, if you like, and from my own experience, quite often the most aggressive are often the leaders of communities, and that is something that in many communities that I've advocated for in terms of cultural reform along those lines. And so there is a lot of work to be done before we can be allowing for a some sort of process to take place that can be basically interpreted however that group decide they choose. This is traditional culture, this is how we're going to do it. We've seen a lot of reinvented culture as well now being passed off as traditional culture. So where does it start? Where does it end, I guess?
Now, this is a question from Lydia in Chatswood, Sydney, and she wants me to put this to the negative side. The Prime Minister is among many people who say that a no vote at the referendum will damage Australia's reputation in the world. A rejection of the constitutional recognition put forward in the Voice would hurt our international relations, as the Prime Minister says. Your response? Jacinta.
Thank you. Well, I think it goes back to what Salvatore was making earlier with his remarks around Indigenous peoples around the world having only one vote within their nation. My dealings certainly with ambassadors of foreign countries suggest to me that there is concern that we would in fact go down this path, especially European nations who only know all too well what dividing countries along the lines of race can do to a nation. And you don't have to look far back in history to see those sorts of horrific outcomes. I think as a nation, we are one of the most successful multicultural nations. We are one of the most tolerant nations in the world, and it is the very reason why we have people from other parts of the world travel here to become part of this great country. And I would suggest that Albanese's language is much like most of his language around this debate. It's emotional blackmail. And I disagree that we would be looked down upon. Just like I disagree with notions that where I come from in the Northern Territory, we're full of redneck racists and victim Aboriginal people, when the Northern Territory is the territory that elected 3 Indigenous women to the federal parliament. And I think we don't do enough to recognise how much of an incredible nation we are, and comments like the comment that the Prime Minister made don't do us any favours.
Well, is the PM's rhetoric here international blackmail? I mean, I should stress, Shireen and Tony, Andrew Neil, one of the world's most distinguished print and broadcast journalists, is in the country. He's a publisher of The Spectator magazine, and he'll be speaking at CIS next Wednesday night here. And the last time Andrew Neil spoke here 5 years ago, he made the point that in many parts of the world for long periods of time, you need very good peripheral vision to see Australia on the map. But to the extent that Australia does get attention, it's usually positive, that we're seen, as Jacinta said, a very vibrant, liberal, tolerant, multiracial society. So following on from Lydia's question, do you think that if there is a no vote at the referendum, would that really hurt our reputation in the world?
On that note, we recently, and forgive me, I can't remember her name, but we had a Maori woman travel to Australia to heed the warning of what the Voice might do, because she understands on the ground in New Zealand as to the outcomes of certainly the Waitangi Tribunal, which is now in place, and the way in which they have veto power over the New Zealand government, to the extent that an example of a policy that they managed to encourage the government to take on was that during COVID, while New Zealand were rolling out their vaccination, they had prioritised the elderly to receive vaccinations first. The Waitangi Tribunal argued that it was Maoris who were particularly, of greater risk in comparison to everybody else. So therefore, they reprioritise the rollout of their vaccines to give young Māori people the vaccine over the elderly population who were in fact non-Māori. And as far as I'm concerned, that is not equality, and that is an example of where things can go terribly wrong on the basis of race.
Thank you. Final thoughts, Jacinta.
Thank you. I will just reiterate what so the delegation of Indigenous people from around the country that Warren and I brought to Parliament the other week, what they said was that they want elected individuals, those of us who are paid by the taxpayer, to represent them in Parliament, as is our job to do through our democracy. And that is the problem that we have, is the fact that there are those of us who are elected who are too concerned about appearing to make the wrong decision or called out and called names, and so therefore this might be an ideal way for them to handball this issue elsewhere. Instead of doing their job, doing our jobs to represent, as Shireen was just saying, sit down with people in community, which is what I do, and help in terms of creating policy, whether it's about education, whether it's about health. I put bills to the Parliament, I put motions to the Parliament, doing exactly that, talking to people in those communities who are affected, attempting to amplify the voices who are largely ignored, who have been ignored through this process, through the voice. It is my job to do that. It's what I've been tasked to do. It's what I was voted to do. And that is what we need to do better in this country.